There's a particular kind of silence that settles over a frontier town in the dead of January, not the peaceful kind, not the kind that lets a man breathe easy and feel grateful for his blankets. It's the silence of stopped things, frozen things, wells that have gone quiet in the worst possible way, where you drop the bucket and hear it hit ice instead of water, and the sound travels up the rope and into your chest and sits there like a stone. I was 26 years old when I first heard that sound. I was keeping a log that winter, not because anyone asked me to, not because I had any grand idea about posterity or historical record. I kept it because my hands needed something to do when my mind was running ahead of itself. And out on the frontier, your mind runs ahead constantly. You're always calculating, always rationing, always counting days against supplies, counting clouds against the expected rain, counting heartbeats against the cold. The log was just a way to slow that counting down, put it on paper, make it real and bounded instead of wild and infinite. I wrote about the mocking first. Not because I was proud of how the town behaved. I wasn't, and I'll say that plainly. But because you can't understand what happened that January without understanding what came before it, and what came before it was laughter. Loud, comfortable, self-certain laughter. The kind that comes easy when a man is warm and well-fed and hasn't yet been introduced to the particular humility that real winter delivers. His name was Keokuk Gray Stone. He was Apache. He was 52 years old. He had lived through droughts that turned rivers to cracks in the earth, and he had dug a cellar 40 feet into the ground beneath his homestead on the western edge of our valley. 40 feet. The settlers laughed. I recorded their jokes faithfully. I thought at the time that the jokes were mostly harmless, frontier people making frontier humor about a man who was doing something none of them understood. I told myself it was just how people behaved when they were frightened of something they couldn't categorize. A man who digs 40 feet down isn't digging a root cellar. He's doing something else entirely. Something that implies a knowledge of this land that the rest of us didn't have. And that kind of implied knowledge makes people uncomfortable in ways they cover with laughter. I didn't laugh, but I didn't say anything either. That's the part I've been trying to make peace with ever since. The temperature dropped to -31 that January. Dropped and stayed there for 11 days straight, which no one in our valley had ever recorded, not in any log I'd ever read, not in any story I'd heard told around a fire. The wells froze, every single one. The creek froze. The stock tanks froze so solid that men broke axe handles trying to open them. Families started rationing the snow they melted over fires, and snow melt tastes like nothing and cleans nothing, and leaves you with a particular kind of desperation that is very different from ordinary thirst. And Keokuk Gray Stone's water stayed liquid. 40 feet down, the earth holds a different temperature than the air above it. 40 feet down, frost doesn't reach. 40 feet down, a man who understood the land he was standing on had built something that looked like madness in September and looked like salvation in January. I want to tell you this story carefully. I want to tell it the way it actually happened, which means I have to tell you about the mocking and the cold and the decisions that were made and the ones that weren't. I have to tell you about what it cost Keokuk to do what he did when the people who had laughed at him came to his door. I have to tell you what it cost me to watch. This is not a story about a man who was proven right. That's too simple. This is a story about what being right actually looks like when it's 30 below and your neighbors are desperate, and about the particular weight a man carries when he knows something the world isn't ready to hear, and builds it anyway. The surveying party I'd been hired to assist was 3 weeks out of Santa Fe, mapping water rights for a land company whose name changed so often I'd stopped tracking it. We were supposed to pass through the valley, take measurements at the creek fork, and continue north toward the high mesa country. But one of our mules developed a limp that the company veterinarian, a man named Fitch, who was approximately as qualified as I was, which is to say not at all, couldn't resolve, and we camped in the valley while we waited for the animal to either improve or die. It improved eventually, but by then I had found myself a temporary position with a man named Aldous Hecht who ran a small timber operation at the valley's eastern end, and I had a reason to stay. 22 cents a day and a dry place to sleep. On the frontier in 1887, that was a reasonable argument for almost anything. The valley itself was maybe 14 miles long and 3 wide at its broadest point. Following a creek called Holt's Run, that had been named for a trapper who died there in 1841, under circumstances the locals described with varying degrees of dramatic embellishment. There were 31 settler families by the time I arrived, most of them farming or ranching, plus a general store, a blacksmith, and something that called itself a hotel but was really just Marguerite Fenwick's house with 3 extra cots in the back room. The Apache land was on the western edge, where the valley narrowed and the creek bent south toward a rocky outwash that didn't look like much from a distance. I say Apache land because that's what people called it, not anyone's specific name. Just Apache land, the way you'd say that stand of cottonwoods, or the place where the trail goes soft. Keokuk Gray Stone had his homestead there, had had it for some years before most of the settler families arrived, had it under a land patent that was legal and recorded and that the county office in Santa Fe had on file. I know because I checked, being the sort of person who checks things. Surveyor's habit. He lived there with his wife, Adiz. She was Hikaria Apache, from a different band than Keokuk's own, which I would only learn later, and their 2 grandchildren, a boy of about 8 named Hosteen and a girl of 6 whose name I never learned to pronounce correctly despite several patient attempts. They lived simply. They kept a small herd of a breed I didn't recognize at first, compact animals, shorter-legged than the cattle I knew, with thick necks and a particular way of holding themselves in wind that suggested they were accustomed to wind. I didn't know what they were eating. I didn't ask. That was my first mistake of many. September 9th, 1887. The digging started on a Thursday. I know it was Thursday because I'd just come from Fenwick's store, where Marguerite kept a calendar behind the counter that she updated with a kind of religious consistency, and I'd noted the date before heading west along the creek to run a measurement for Hecht that I'd been putting off. The sound of digging, the specific rhythm of a pickaxe striking hard soil, rest, strike, rest, reached me before I could see the source. He was working alone. No, that's not quite right. He was working first. By the time I'd gotten close enough to watch without being rude about it, Adiz was there too, pulling a rope that was attached to a wooden bucket being hauled up from a hole that was already, by my estimate, 8 or 9 feet deep. The boy Hosteen sat at the edge, watching with the focused attention of a child who is genuinely interested rather than merely present. "Morning," I said. Keokuk didn't look up from the hole. He was down in it, loosening dirt with a short-handled pick. He had a way of working that was almost musical, not fast, not frantic, but utterly continuous and efficient with no wasted motion. "Morning," he said to the dirt. "What are you putting in?" I asked. "Cellar. Root cellar." He paused at that, looked up. He had a broad face with deep-set eyes that were evaluating me with a calm that I found slightly unnerving, not because it was hostile, but because it was so completely without pretense. He wasn't performing patience. He was just patient. "Water cellar," he said. "How deep?" He looked down at his hole, then back at me. 40 feet. I wrote that number in my log that night and stared at it for a while. 40 feet. I'd done enough surveying to understand what that meant in terms of labor. A man digging alone, even with help 40 feet into rocky valley soil by hand with pick and shovel and bucket. That was months of work. That was a decision made with enormous certainty or enormous stubbornness or both. I didn't know enough yet to understand which it was. September 14th, 1887. Word travels fast in small places. By the second week, Keokuk's digging was a topic of conversation at Fenwick's store and at the blacksmith's, and I suspected at every dinner table in the valley. The nature of the conversation I will characterize as follows. It was not kind, but it was not entirely vicious either. It was the particular flavor of frontier mockery that lives in that space between dismissal and genuine curiosity. People laughing at something because laughing is easier than admitting they don't understand it. 40 feet, said a man named Breckett Soames, who ran cattle on the valley's northern end and had a talent for saying things with a confidence that made them sound more considered than they were. What in God's name does a man need 40 feet of cellar for? He could store a whole town's worth of potatoes. The laughter at Fenwick's counter was easy, warm, well-fed. "Maybe he's planning to move to China," offered someone else. More laughter. I didn't say anything. I bought my tobacco and my lamp oil and went back to my bunk at Hecht's timber operation and wrote the jokes down in my log. which is what I did with things that bothered me in ways I couldn't yet articulate. I've thought about that choice many times since. September 20th, 1887. I went back to watch the digging again. This time I brought a lunch pail and sat on a boulder about 20 yards off and ate my biscuits while Adiz worked the hauling rope and Keokuk worked below. The hole was maybe 15 feet deep now. They'd built a simple timber frame around the opening, solid work, well-joined, the kind of construction that speaks to someone who has done this before or been taught by someone who has. Hostin came and sat near me. He had the same evaluating quality as his grandfather, watching me watch the operation with a patience that I found slightly amusing and slightly shaming. "Your grandfather do this before?" I asked. "His father," Hostin said, "and his father's father." "Where?" Hostin looked at me with an expression that was perfectly polite and perfectly opaque. "Here," he said, meaning something much larger than the valley. "This land." I chewed my biscuit and thought about that. His father's father. Digging into this specific earth not as an experiment but as an inheritance, something learned over generations of living in a place and understanding what it did in winter, what it did in drought, what it held in its deep layers that the surface refused to show. "The settlers think it's funny," I said. I don't know why I said it. I think I wanted to see what he'd do with the information. "I know," Hostin said. He didn't look bothered. "Grandfather knows too." "Doesn't it bother him?" The boy thought about this with genuine seriousness, the way children do when they're not yet old enough to give the social answer instead of the true one. "He says that the land knows what it is," Hostin said finally. "Other people's opinions don't change the temperature." I wrote that down in my log that night, word for word. October 3rd, 1887. The digging continued. 20 feet now, by my estimate. They developed a system with a rope and pulley arrangement that made the bucket hauling more efficient, and Keokuk had brought in a second worker, a quiet man whose relationship to the family I never entirely worked out, who spelled him at the pick during the afternoon hours. I brought measurements I'd been running along the creek's western section and stopped in. Adiz was tending the cattle, those compact, thick-necked animals I still couldn't identify, and looked at me with a straightforward assessment that was somehow both warmer and more direct than her husband's. "You come a lot," she said. "I'm curious," I said. "Good," she said, as if that settled something. She handed me a tin cup of something warm without being asked. It was a tea made from something I didn't recognize, mildly bitter and faintly mineral, and she watched me drink it with an expression that might have been amusement. "What are those cattle?" I asked, gesturing at the herd. "Old ones," she said. "Criollo from before the Spanish changed everything." She said it without bitterness, just as a statement of chronology of fact. "They walk farther, drink less, get cold, and keep walking. The settlers don't keep them." "No. Why not?" She looked at me steadily. "Because they're smaller, less meat on the frame, settlers count pounds." She paused. "We count winters." I wrote that down too. October 19th, 1887. The mocking reached a kind of peak in late October, when Beckett Soames organized what he called an inspection party. 6 or 7 men riding out to Keokuk's homestead on the pretext of being neighborly, and the actual purpose of having a closer look at whatever lunacy was happening at 40 feet. I wasn't invited. I heard about it afterward from a man named Desmond Chalk, who operated the blacksmith's forge and had a conscience that occasionally troubled him enough to make him uncomfortable around sustained cruelty, even the low-level frontier variety. "They rode up," Desmond told me, cleaning a hinge fitting with a rag, not looking at me while he spoke. "Soames made some remarks, called it the biggest waste of Apache effort he'd ever seen. Said the ground would cave in before he hit 20 feet. He paused. The Apache man just kept working, didn't even come up out of the hole." "How deep is it now?" Soames said maybe 25 feet, hard to tell from the surface. I imagined Keokuk down in that hole, 25 feet below the laughter, working his pick in its continuous rhythm, the sound of the settlers' voices filtering down to him through 25 feet of rocky soil. I wondered what that felt like, whether the ground muffled it enough that it was just noise, or whether the specific frequency of contempt carried even through rock. "What did the woman say?" I asked. Desmond paused. She offered them water. "They take it." Soames didn't, a couple of the others did. He set down the hinge. Good water, cold. Soames made a joke about that, too. Said she probably hauled it in from the creek and was playing some kind of Indian trick. I felt something sharp and unpleasant move through my chest. I didn't say anything about it. I bought the fittings I'd come for and went back to work, and that night I wrote in my log, "There is a particular kind of pride that mistakes ignorance for cleverness. I have seen it before. I have on occasion exhibited it myself. The fact that I recognize it does not mean I am adequately fighting against it." Then I went to sleep, and in the morning I got up and went to work for Hecht and didn't ride out to Keokuk's place for 3 days, because I was embarrassed of my own inaction in ways I wasn't yet equipped to examine honestly. November 2nd, 1887. 30 feet. By early November the hole was 30 feet deep, and something had shifted in the way the settler community talked about it. The jokes were still there, but they developed a slightly defensive quality, the particular defensiveness of people who are starting to wonder if they've been wrong about something, but aren't ready to stop laughing, because stopping would mean admitting that they'd been wrong. I rode out specifically to measure. Not the hole, there was no particular reason I needed to know its depth, professionally speaking, but to confirm what I thought I was seeing in the landscape around Keokuk's homestead, because I was a surveyor's assistant and I had an eye for ground. What I saw when I looked carefully was this. The land on Keokuk's western edge sat slightly lower than the surrounding terrain, in a specific geological way that spoke of old water movement, ancient drainage. The soil composition at the surface was different from the rest of the valley floor, finer grained, with a particular clay content that I recognized from survey work I'd done in other places. Soil that clay-heavy didn't freeze the same way as loamier ground. It held different. And if the geological formation ran the way I thought it might, if there was a layer of less porous material at a certain depth, above which groundwater collected and remained relatively stable, then 40 feet might not be madness. 40 feet might be exactly right. I didn't say this at Fenwick's store. I wrote it in my log instead, which is the coward's version of saying something, and I knew it. November 15th, 1887. The first real cold came in mid-November. Not the killing cold that would wait, but the announcement cold, the kind that drops in overnight and makes a man's breath visible and turns the water in the stock tanks to thin ice by morning. Nothing that couldn't be broken with a stick, nothing that constituted a real emergency. Just a reminder. I noticed that Keokuk's cattle, those small, thick-necked Criollo animals, didn't seem to change much in their behavior. They bunched slightly but didn't huddle the way the settlers' bigger animals did, pressing against fences and bawling in the cold. They just moved a little slower and kept eating, and looked at the frost with what I can only describe as equanimity. The settlers' cattle lost condition faster in the cold. They required more feed to maintain body weight. The math of winter livestock management in a place this cold was brutal, and I was beginning to understand that different animals managed it differently, that the settlers' preference for large, meaty cattle was a preference optimized for a calculation that didn't fully account for what this specific valley did in January. Keokuk was at 35 feet now. The timber frame at the top was more elaborate, a proper coping, with a windlass for the bucket. Hosteen was big enough to help with the cranking. "Almost there," I said, watching. "2 more weeks," Keokuk said, from up at the surface this time, resting. He had a way of resting that was complete, fully stopped, fully quiet, and then of starting again that was equally complete, with no gradual transition between the states. Like a man who had mastered the discipline of being entirely in whatever condition was appropriate. "What do you expect to find at 40 feet?" I asked. He looked at me with that evaluating calm. "What's already there?" he said. "And what's that?" "Water that doesn't know what winter is." I wrote that in my log that night with 2 lines underlined beneath it. December 1st, 1887. He finished the cellar on the 1st of December. 40 feet. Lined with flat stones from the creek bed that Adiz and Hosteen had hauled in a small cart over a period of weeks. The lining went from top to bottom, neatly fitted, the way someone fits stones who has fitted stones before and knows that a wall built crooked at the bottom becomes a catastrophe at the top. There was a timber cap at the top with a hinged lid, weighted against wind. A rope and pulley system on a permanent timber arm for raising and lowering the bucket. A secondary rope attached to a wooden handle for people to hold while they descended if they needed to go down. I saw it completed. I happened to be running a measurement along the creek when a D's called down to Keokuk that the last stone was in place, and I came over without being invited and looked down into the shaft, which was too deep to see the bottom of in the early December light. "May I asked, gesturing at the rope. Keokuk looked at me for a moment, that long, calm look. Then he nodded. They lowered me in the bucket. It was a strange experience. The temperature changed as I descended. I felt it as a physical transition, somewhere between 15 and 20 feet down, where the air went from cold and biting to something else. Not warm exactly, but not cold in the same way. A steadiness. By 30 feet, it was almost comfortable. At the bottom, in the darkness, with only the light from the shaft above me, I could hear water. Not rushing, a low, settled sound, like breath. There was a natural seep in the stone at the cellar's eastern wall that produced a steady trickle into a stone-lined basin that Keokuk had chiseled into the floor. The basin was full. The water was clear and cold, and absolutely, definitively liquid. I sat at the bottom of a 40-foot shaft in the first days of December and listened to water moving in the earth and thought about all the jokes I had heard and not challenged, and felt something between awe and shame that I still don't have a clean single word for. They pulled me up. I stood at the surface in the hard, cold air and looked at Keokuk, who was watching me with that same patient face. "It works," I said. "It works," he agreed. "The settlers think." "I know what the settlers think," he said gently, not angrily. Gently, the way you'd say it to someone who is stating the obvious because they don't know what else to say. "Why did you do it anyway?" He was quiet for a moment. He looked west, toward the ridgeline where the valley narrowed and the last light of December afternoon was doing something complicated with the clouds. "Because my grandfather did it," he said, "and his, and because the land doesn't change what it is because people don't believe it." I rode back to Hecht's place in the late afternoon cold, and I wrote more in my log that night than I had in any single session since I'd arrived in Holt Valley. I wrote about the water and the temperature change in the shaft and the stone lining and the seep in the wall and the basin. I wrote about what I understood geologically and what I still didn't, and then I wrote something that I didn't understand until much later. A man who builds something the world doesn't believe in is either a fool or a prophet, and you can rarely tell which until the worst possible moment. The tragedy is that the worst possible moment is precisely when you have the least time to recalibrate. I didn't know when I wrote that the worst possible moment was 6 weeks away. December 20th, 1887. Christmas approached, and the valley settled into the comfortable rhythms of a frontier winter that was not yet serious, cold enough to require care, not cold enough to require fear. Families visited. Fenwick's store did brisk business in small luxuries. Soames held a gathering at his ranch house that I attended because Desmond Chalk invited me, and I had nothing else to do. And the evening was pleasant enough in the way that evenings can be pleasant when everyone present has enough to eat and drink, and the cold outside is a backdrop rather than a threat. Someone made a joke about Keokuk's cellar. A light joke, the kind you make when the subject is already finished business, already categorized and filed away as harmless eccentricity. The laughter was lighter too, the laughter of people who have moved on from something, which sometimes means they've understood it, and sometimes means they've merely stopped paying attention to it. I didn't laugh. Desmond noticed. He looked at me with a slight frown, the way he did when he was uncomfortable about something and couldn't say it directly. I drank my whiskey and watched the fire, and wrote nothing in my log that night, because sometimes things are too heavy for even a log. January 4th, 1888. The temperature dropped on a Sunday. Not gradually, not with the polite warning of a few cloudy days and a gradual slide. It dropped overnight, precipitously, the way this particular country drops temperature when a certain kind of weather system comes in from the northwest, down through the mountain passes, gathering cold as it comes, arriving in the valley like something that has made a decision. I woke up at 3 in the morning because the fire had gone low and my blankets weren't sufficient, and the cold in Hecht's bunkhouse was physical pressing. The thermometer outside read -17. I felt cold before. I grew up in Missouri winters, and I'd worked 3 seasons in the high country, but this was different in character. This was the cold that doesn't negotiate. By Monday morning, it was -23. By Tuesday, it was -28. I want to be precise about the sequence of events, because sequence matters when you're trying to understand how people behave under pressure. It's easy, looking back, to compress it into a single dramatic moment. The wells froze, everything changed. But it wasn't like that. It was gradual in the most terrifying way, which is the way that doesn't announce itself but accumulates. The first well to go was the Hanratty family's, at the valley's southern end. I heard about it Wednesday morning at Fenwick's store, where Margaret Hanratty had come to ask if Marguerite had extra water stored, and the conversation around that single request opened up something that everyone had been half aware of but not saying aloud, the question of supply, of what happened if the cold held. Marguerite had a cistern. She gave the Hanrattys what she could spare. By Wednesday evening, 4 more wells had frozen solid. The creek froze Thursday. Not at the edges, those had been frozen since November, but all the way through, solid ice from bank to bank. The current underneath slowed to something that no longer reached the surface in any usable way. Men went out with axes and broke holes, but the water that came up was silty and slow, and the holes refroze within hours. I went to my log that Thursday evening and wrote, -31, still falling. 7 wells confirmed frozen, creek sealed, beginning to understand what 40 feet means. I sat with that sentence for a long time. January 8th, 1888, Thursday. The snowmelt operation began. I want to describe what this actually involved because there's a romantic version of frontier survival that compresses it into something picturesque, hardy settlers melting snow over fires, and the reality was considerably less charming. Snow melt for drinking requires enormous quantities of snow to produce modest quantities of water. The snow in Holt Valley was dry, which means it was low density, which means it was even less efficient than wet snow. You needed roughly 10 to 12 gallons of snow to produce 1 gallon of water. You needed fire to melt it, which required wood, and wood was not infinite, and every log burned for water production was a log not burned for warmth. The math was not comfortable. Children were being wrapped in every available textile. Babies were kept in the beds with their mothers, not because this was comfortable, but because it was warmth arithmetic. Combined body heat in a small space under enough blankets could maintain survivable temperature even when the fire burned low. I saw this at the chalk house, where Desmond's wife Nora had organized their 3 children and herself, and Desmond, into a single sleeping arrangement that she described to me with a kind of grim practical efficiency that I found both admirable and deeply unnerving. "How much wood do you have?" I asked Desmond at his forge, which he was keeping going more for the heat than for any metalworking purpose. 2 weeks, he said, maybe 3 if we're careful. "And the temperature?" He looked at the thermometer mounted outside his door. "Still dropping," he said. We stood there for a moment in the specific silence of 2 men who are looking at numbers and don't like the way they add up. January 9th, 1888. It was Beckett Soames who first said Keokuk's name in the context of water. I was at Fenwick's store. I kept going there because it was a gathering point, a place where information moved, and I needed to understand what was happening across the whole valley to make any useful calculations. Soames came in around midday, and he had a quality I hadn't seen in him before: quiet. Not his usual loud, confident quiet, but a different kind, with an edge of something underneath it that I recognized as the first stage of fear. He bought a bag of oats without the usual commentary. Then, at the door, he stopped. "The Apache's cellar," he said to the room generally. "His water, it's still—" He stopped, started again. "I heard it's still liquid." "That's what they're saying," Marguerite said, behind the counter with a careful neutrality. Soames nodded, stood there for a moment, then he went out without saying anything else. The room was quiet after he left. A woman named Paulette Dreer, who kept a small boarding house at the valley's center, said, in a voice that was trying to be conversational and not quite managing it, 40 feet. It's the depth that does it. The earth is warmer down deep." "He's been drawing water up fine," said the man next to her. "Hosteen was at the store yesterday and I asked. The boy said his grandfather was drawing water every morning, same as always." I felt something moving through the room that I can only describe as the atmosphere before a decision. The charged quality of a group of people who are close to doing something, but haven't quite allowed themselves to name it yet. I went home and wrote in my log, "They are going to ask him. The only question is when and in what form and what it costs everyone involved." January 10th, 1888, Saturday. I went to Keokuk's homestead early on Saturday morning, before anyone else. This was a decision I made deliberately, and then almost unmade 3 times on the ride over, which took longer than usual because the cold made the horses reluctant and required a pace that was more negotiation than riding. My breath fogged so thickly I could barely see ahead of it. The thermometer outside Fenwick's had read -31 that morning, and I believed it. The homestead was quiet in the way that places are quiet when the people in them are going about their business without urgency or pretense. Smoke rose from the chimney in a thin, straight column, the kind of column that means a well-managed fire, not a desperate one. The cattle were in a small pen near the house, those compact Criollo animals standing with their heads down and their backs to the wind in a way that looked practiced. Keokuk was at the cellar. He was drawing water, cranking the windlass with the slow, rhythmic competence I'd come to associate with everything he did, and he looked at me as I dismounted without apparent surprise. "Cold," I said, because I needed to say something. "Yes," he agreed, turning the windlass. "The wells are frozen, most of them." "Yes." "The creek." "Yes." The bucket came up. The water in it steamed slightly in the cold air, not because it was warm, but because it was liquid in an environment cold enough that even the brief temperature differential produced vapor. I stared at it. It was the most significant thing I'd seen in weeks, possibly in my life, and it was just a bucket. "They'll come," I said. Keokuk set the bucket down and looked at me steadily. "I know. Soames was asking about you at Fenwick's yesterday." Something crossed his face at Soames's name, not anger, not satisfaction, but something more complicated. A kind of weariness that was also, I thought, a kind of sad recognition. He'd known this was coming. He'd probably known it since September. "What will you do?" I asked. He looked at his cellar, at the valley, at the cold white landscape that stretched back toward the settler homesteads. Then he said something that I have written and rewritten in my log many times since, trying to get it exactly right, because exact matters. A man has to decide, when he knows something that others don't, whether that knowledge belongs to him or to everyone who needs it. "And which is it?" I asked. "It was never mine," he said. "I just kept it alive until it was needed." I rode back to Heck's place, and I cried a little on the way, which I would not have admitted to anyone at the time, and am including here only because accuracy requires it. I'm not sure entirely what I was crying about. Part of it was the water and the cold and the practical terror of the situation. Part of it was something else, the particular grief of watching someone be right in a way that required extraordinary patience and dignity to be right in, surrounded by people who had given them every possible reason to choose otherwise. January 11th, 1888. Soames came on Sunday morning. He came alone, which surprised me when I heard about it later. I had expected a group, the same kind of collective that had come for the inspection in October, safety in numbers and all that. But he came alone, on a horse that was moving carefully on icy ground, and he came to the front of Keokuk's house rather than stopping at a distance, and he dismounted and he knocked. Adiz opened the door. I wasn't there for this. I'm reconstructing it from what Adiz told me later, and from what Hosteen told me, and from the quality of what Soames said at Fenwick's afterward, which was filtered through his particular character and thus requires some interpretive adjustment. He asked for water. He didn't apologize. I don't think he was capable of it in the form it should have taken, direct, named, specific about what had been said and done. But he asked for water with a quality in his voice that Adiz described to me as like a man who has swallowed something that didn't agree with him, and she invited him in. Keokuk was there. The 2 men were in the same room, the man who had spent 3 months digging through ridicule and the man who had been loudest in the ridicule. And Hosteen told me that his grandfather offered Soames a chair and Adiz brought him tea, and no one said anything about September or October or any of the jokes. They talked about the cold, about the creek, about how long the temperature might hold. Keokuk told Soames that the cellar produced clean water indefinitely. It was a seep, not a finite reservoir, fed by subsurface flow that the depth kept from freezing. He said that there was enough for the valley if they were organized about it. Soames asked what he wanted in return. Keokuk said he hadn't thought about it in those terms. Hosteen told me that Soames's face did something complicated at that answer that Hosteen didn't have a word for at 8 years old. I thought I knew what the complication was. It's difficult to receive generosity from someone you've wronged, particularly when the generosity comes without conditions, because conditions would let you keep the transaction clean. Generosity without conditions makes you look at yourself. Soames left after an hour. He went directly to Fenwick's store and told everyone who was there that Keokuk was willing to share his water, that the cellar produced enough, that they needed to organize themselves into groups and establish a rotation, and that he, Soames, would coordinate it. He didn't mention the months of jokes. He said the words Apache family once neutrally in context, and he moved on. But he organized the rotation, and he rode to every homestead himself to communicate it. And he did it with a thoroughness and efficiency that I think was, in some complicated way, the only form of apology he had available. January 12th, 1888 month. The first organized water collection began on Monday morning, an hour after dawn. I went, not because I was part of the rotation. Hecht's operation had a small cistern that was still adequate, but because I needed to see it, and because I thought someone should write it down who didn't have a stake in how it reflected on anyone. The first family was the Dreer family, Paulette and her husband, Gerald, and their 4 children, the youngest of whom was carried in a blanket-wrapped bundle that made her look like a very serious parcel. They came with a cart and 4 large wooden casks, and they pulled up to Keokuk's cellar, and Hosteen was already there, cranking the windlass, and Adiz was there with a ladle for checking the water and a tin cup for whoever needed it first. Paulette Dreer had been one of the people who'd mentioned the 40 feet at Fenwick's, not a mocker exactly, but part of the ambient noise of community dismissal. She stood at the cellar opening and looked down into it, and then she looked at Adiz and she said, "Thank you," and the words came out of her like they were something she'd been holding under pressure and had finally allowed to escape. Adiz nodded, not formally, warmly. The warmth of a woman who knows the difference between what's easy and what's right, and has decided not to make the difference into a production. The children watched the bucket come up with expressions of total fascination. The youngest, from inside her blanket bundle, made a sound that was not quite a word. I watched the water go into the casks. I watched the steam rise from it in the cold air. I watched Hosteen lower the bucket again with the practiced ease of a boy who had watched this operation in preparation for weeks, who had known, in the way that children of capable people know things, that this day would come. "Grandfather said it would be like this," Hosteen told me, during a moment when the adults were occupied with securing the casks to the cart. "Like what?" "People would need it." He said it without triumph, just as information. He said, "We are not the land, but we can know what the land knows, and knowing it is a responsibility." I wrote that down right there, standing in the cold, because I was afraid I'd change it if I waited. January 13th, 18th, 1888. 6 days of organized water collection. I am going to compress this section, because to describe each day individually would be accurate but not illuminating. The pattern, once established, held, and the variations within it are less important than the overall shape of what happened. The families came in rotation. Soames had organized them by distance, closest families first in the morning, farther families in the afternoon, so that no one was traveling in the worst of the cold at peak exertion, and then having to travel home in declining temperatures with wet cargo. This was, I noted, competent logistical thinking. Soames was many things, but stupid was not among them. Keokuk and Adiz and Hosteen worked the cellar every day. On the 3rd day, Keokuk invited anyone who wanted to see the construction to come down in the bucket. Several people went. A man named Whitfield, who was a carpenter and had opinions about structural integrity, went down and came up saying nothing for 10 minutes, and then said that the stone lining was the finest dry stack work he'd ever seen. He said it to Desmond Chalk, not to Keokuk directly, which is the kind of cowardice that passes for politeness in small communities. But Desmond told Keokuk, and Keokuk's only response was to ask if Whitfield would be interested in discussing some of the techniques sometime, because he'd had a difficult corner on the north face that he hadn't fully resolved. Whitfield came back the next day to talk about stones. They spent 2 hours at the cellar opening, Keokuk drawing diagrams in the dirt, Whitfield asking questions. I watched from a distance, writing notes in my log with fingers that were getting stiff in the cold, and thought, This is what it looks like when knowledge stops being embarrassing and starts being useful. The embarrassment doesn't go away, it just gets rerouted. There were difficult moments. On the fourth day, a man named Everett Harmon, who had been one of the louder laughers in September, came for water and stood at the cellar opening for a long time before he could look at Keokuk directly. He finally did. He said, "I was wrong." He said it badly, wrong word order, wrong emphasis, the sentence structure of a man reading something he hasn't memorized, but he said it. Keokuk handed him the bucket and said, "How's your herd holding up in this cold?" And that was that. Harmon filled his casks and they talked about cattle for a while and Harmon left. And later I saw him at Fenwick's telling someone that Keokuk kept a breed he'd never seen before, very compact, very tough, and that he was thinking he might like to know more about them. Keokuk's cattle were fine, for the record. They'd pulled through the cold without the dramatic condition loss that was hitting the settlers' larger animals, and the difference was going to show up in spring, calving numbers in ways that I suspected would generate another round of questions. I was writing everything down. My log for this period is more volume than I've produced in any equivalent time before or since. January 17th, 1888, Wednesday. Something happened on the 6th day that I need to document carefully, because it's the thing I think about most when I think about this winter. A woman named Clara Jessup came for water alone. Her husband had died the previous autumn, fever, and she was managing a small homestead with 2 sons, 13 and 15, and the kind of stoic capability that women in difficult situations develop out of pure necessity. She was not someone who complained or made scenes. She came for water with her older son driving the cart, loaded her casks, and was about to leave when Adiz came out of the house with a cloth-wrapped bundle. "For the winter," Adiz said. She pressed the bundle into Clara's hands. Clara unwrapped it enough to see inside. It was seeds, a remarkable variety, packed in small, folded papers, each one labeled in a hand I didn't recognize. I would learn later that it was a collection Adiz had been curating for years. Drought-resistant varieties, cold-hardy varieties, plants that had been grown in this specific valley, and therefore carried in their germination requirements a knowledge of this specific climate. Clara Jessup looked at the seeds and then at Adiz, and her face did something that I cannot adequately describe. It was not a simple expression. It was the face of a woman who has been managing without help for long enough that the receipt of help has become almost physically overwhelming, who has been holding herself together with both hands for months, and has just had one of those hands touched gently by someone else, and doesn't know whether to sob or smile or simply stand very still and breathe. She stood very still. "Thank you," she said eventually, in a voice that had something fractured in it. Adiz nodded. "Plant the ground before the last frost. The valley needs different plants. The ones people brought don't always know this soil." Clara carried those seeds home wrapped in her coat, against her body, like they were something alive. I wrote about it that night and stopped 3 times and started again. I couldn't get it right. I still don't think I've gotten it right. January 19th, 1888. The temperature began to moderate on Friday morning. Not dramatically, not an immediate return to anything comfortable, but the thermometer outside Fenwick's moved from -31 to -24 overnight, and then to -19 by midday, and the specific quality of the cold changed in a way that was perceptible even without instruments. A slight softening, a willingness to negotiate. I stood outside Heck's bunkhouse and looked at the sky, which had changed from the flat, terrible white of the worst days to something with more texture, clouds moving again, and I felt something release in my chest that I hadn't realized I'd been holding. At Fenwick's that afternoon, the mood was different. Not jubilant. People don't become jubilant immediately after 11 days of -31. They become cautiously, exhaustedly relieved, but different. People were talking about spring, about what they'd lost and what they hadn't, about which animals had made it and which hadn't. About Keokuk. The conversation was different from September's. It was quieter, more specific. People talking about the construction of the cellar, the geological reasoning behind it, the way the temperature changed at depth. A man named Ellison, who farmed the valley's widest section, was saying that he'd been thinking about what it would take to sink a shaft of his own, and whether Keokuk might be willing to advise on the approach. There was still awkwardness in it. The gap between what should have been said in September and what was being said now was visible to anyone who was paying attention, and most people were paying attention while pretending not to, But the conversation was happening. The knowledge was moving. That felt like something. January 21st, 1888, son. I rode out to Keokuk's place one more time before the thaw became ordinary. I don't know entirely why. Gratitude, maybe, or the need to say something I'd been not saying for months, or just the surveyor's instinct to return to the site and confirm the measurements. He was at the cellar drawing water. The cold was still significant but manageable, the kind of cold a man can stand in and breathe easily and make decisions in, rather than the kind that narrows your mind to survival arithmetic. Hosteen was helping. Adiz was somewhere in the house. I could hear movement. "The temperature's breaking," I said. "Yes," Keokuk said. "The wells will thaw in a week or two." "Yes. People are talking about sinking their own cellars, come spring." He nodded, as if this were information he'd expected. I stood there for a moment, looking at the cellar, the timber frame, the windlass, the stone-lined shaft going 40 feet into the earth. An ordinary man could walk past it and see a hole in the ground. You had to know what you were looking at to see the years of knowledge it represented, the patience, the refusal to be argued out of something true by people who hadn't bothered to learn what they were laughing at. "I should have said something," I said, "in September, when people were making the jokes." Keokuk looked at me. I knew, or I suspected, that the geology made sense, that the depth made sense. I didn't say anything. "Why not?" he asked, genuinely curious rather than accusing. "I don't know," I said, which was partially true. The fuller truth was something about the social cost of being the person who says the uncomfortable thing, and the way that cost feels large when you're calculating it in advance and small in retrospect. And the fact that I had chosen comfort over clarity in a way that I found, examining it closely, difficult to fully excuse. "You wrote it down," he said. I stared at him. "How did you?" "Hosteen saw your log the day you sat on the rock and ate your biscuits." He said it without reproach, just as fact. "The boy reads well. He said you were writing about the depth, about what the ground might hold at depth." I thought about the boy sitting next to me in September, watching me write, with that old, patient, evaluating quality. I thought about how little I had given him credit for. "Writing it down is something," Keokuk said. "It's not nothing." "It's not enough." "No," he agreed, "but it's the start of enough." He looked at his cellar. "My grandfather wrote nothing down. He kept it only in his memory and in the memories of the people he taught. And when he died, some of it died with him. What's written stays." He paused, "even if the writer is embarrassed of themselves." I laughed because there was nothing else to do with that. He handed me the bucket of water, fresh from 40 feet down, steam rising gently in the cold air. "Drink something," he said. The wells came back one by one. It's a strange thing to watch, a well thawing. You go to it every morning and drop your bucket and wait for the sound, and for days you hear ice, and then one morning there's a different quality to the impact, a slight give, a hint of movement beneath, and then another morning you hear water. Just water. Plain, ordinary, life-sustaining water, and you stand there with the rope in your hands, and you feel something that is a combination of relief and a kind of retrospective terror. The terror you push back during an emergency and allow yourself to feel only after it's resolved. I visited 5 different wells as they thawed. I wrote down the dates and the depths and the sound each one made as it came back. I don't know why I needed to record this so precisely. Surveyor's habit, maybe. The instinct to measure things that have been frightening, because measurement implies control. The first to thaw was the Dreer well on February 1st. Paulette Dreer cried in her yard. She didn't try to hide it. Gerald Dreer stood next to her with his hand on her shoulder and didn't try to manage it, which I thought spoke well of both of them. Keokuk Cellar kept producing through the thaw. The families that had been coming for water in the rotation kept coming for a few more days, partly because their own wells weren't fully reliable yet, and partly, I think, because the habit of coming had created something, a pattern of contact, of conversation, of the kind of adjacency that produces information exchange. People were talking to Keokuk and Adiz now in ways they hadn't before. Not dramatically, not in scenes of public transformation, just talking. Ellison came and spent an hour looking at the cellar construction. He brought a carpenter's plumb line and measured things and asked questions about the stone lining technique, and Keokuk answered with the same patient precision he brought to everything. They made plans, tentative ones, for Keokuk to consult on a smaller version of the structure. Ellison estimated 20 feet would serve him adequately, given his well's position, to be dug in the spring. Whitfield the carpenter came back, and they had 2 more sessions on the stone-fitting question that had been left unresolved. Clara Jessup came with seeds, not to return them, to ask questions about how to plant them. Adiz spent an afternoon with her at the kitchen table, explaining soil preparation, spacing, the particular way this valley received its water in spring, and where the drainage was good and where it pooled. Clara listened with the focused attention of a woman who knows she's receiving something worth receiving, and took notes on a piece of paper with a pencil she kept sharpening. Her older son, the 15-year-old, came too and mostly just listened, but at one point asked Hostin a question about the cattle, the compact ones, the Criollo, and the 2 boys ended up outside for an hour while Hostin showed him something about how they stood in wind and why it mattered. I was there for most of this. I kept coming back. I told Hecht I was doing supplementary surveying in the area, which was not entirely false. I did keep running measurements. But the real reason was that something was happening in that homestead that I needed to see through to whatever its end was, even though I understood that its end was not going to be a dramatic conclusion. This was not the kind of story that ends. It's the kind that continues, changing shape, generating new chapters from the residue of what came before. February 14th, 1888. Valentine's Day. Not that the frontier observed it with particular ceremony, but Marguerite Fenwick put a small paper heart in her window, and the gesture was cheerful enough that people mentioned it. I had a conversation with Soames on this day that I want to record accurately. He came into Fenwick's store while I was there, and there was a moment where we were the only 2 customers, and Marguerite was in the back getting something, and the silence between us had a weight that suggested one of us was going to say something that had been accumulating. He said, "You knew." I looked at him. The cellar, the depth, you knew it made sense. He wasn't accusing. His voice had the quality of a man making an inventory, sorting through things, assessing what they add up to. "I suspected," I said. "Geologically, I wrote it in my log." "But you didn't say anything." "No." He nodded slowly. "Neither did I, and I actively made it worse." He said this looking at the counter rather than at me, which I didn't hold against him. Looking at people when you're accounting for yourself is something most people can't manage, and the accounting was the part that mattered. "What are you going to do with that?" I asked. He looked up. "What do you mean?" "Knowing you were wrong, what do you do with it?" He thought about this for a longer moment than I expected. "Keep my mouth closed when I don't know something," he said finally. "Ask more questions before I open it." He paused. "And maybe see about getting a Criollo bull for my herd." I laughed. He laughed too, a shorter, somewhat rueful version of his usual sound. "Is that enough?" I asked. "Probably not," he said. "But it's what I've got." Marguerite came back from the storeroom and we bought our things and went our separate ways, and I thought, that's the honest version of reckoning. Not theatrical, not complete, not sufficient in any ultimate accounting, but real. A man looking at what he did and deciding to do something different, even if the something different is smaller than the situation deserves. February 28th, 1888. I had a longer conversation with Keokuk in late February that I want to set down in full, or as close to full as my notes allow. He'd been spending time in the preceding weeks responding to the various requests for consultation that had accumulated. Ellison, Whitfield, a few others who wanted to understand what he'd built and why. He was generous with this time in a way that I noticed cost him something, not in a resentful way, but in the way that any sustained effort of translation costs. Explaining things in the language of people whose framework is different from yours requires a kind of constant internal navigation. We were sitting outside on a morning that was cold but manageable, the kind of February cold that contains within it the first hint of eventual spring, the barely perceptible modification of light that tells you the worst is done. He was working on something with his hands, a length of rawhide that he was braiding into a headstall, moving his fingers with an automatic precision that freed his attention for conversation. "What happens now?" I asked. "Now," he said, "is already happening. The consultations, the people asking about the cellar." "Yes. Is that what you wanted?" He was quiet for a moment, fingers continuing their work. My grandfather built a cellar, he said, when the Spanish were moving through this country and the Apache were being pushed in directions that were not theirs to choose. He built it because it was necessary, because his family needed water, because the land could provide it at a certain depth, and because knowing that was a survival skill and not an idea. He paused. He didn't build it to teach anyone. He built it because he knew something and the knowledge had to be made real to stay real. But now people are learning from it. The land is teaching. I just made a hole at the right depth. He said this genuinely rather than falsely modest. He meant the distinction between the knowledge itself and the particular person who happened to hold it. The knowledge belonged to the land. He was a carrier. Your grandfather would have given it to people who laughed at him. Keokuk glanced at me. He gave it to me, he said. I wasn't always a good student. I thought about that, the young Keokuk, learning from an elder, probably impatient, probably making the errors that young people make when they think they know things they haven't yet fully earned. The idea that patience and competence aren't inherited but accumulated, that even the man sitting across from me had been someone who had to learn, had to fail, had to come around to understanding. How long did it take, I asked, to fully understand what your grandfather knew? He looked at the rawhide in his hands. I'm still learning it, he said. I'll die still learning it. That's not an answer. No, he agreed, but it's honest. The braiding continued. Somewhere near the cattle pen, Hosteen was doing something that involved a length of rope and a fence post, and a patience I found impressive in an 8-year-old. What does the boy know? I asked. Keokuk watched his grandson for a moment. Everything I've shown him, he said, which is less than he'll need. So I keep showing him things. The settlers' children will know it too, someday. Ellison's boy came with him last week. Yes. Is that different, having them learn it? He considered this seriously. Knowledge that only goes one direction eventually stops, he said. My grandfather taught me I'm teaching Hosteen. If I teach someone else's child also. He paused, not theatrically, just thinking, then it doesn't stop when Hosteen stops. I thought about what it must have taken to make that choice. To open the hand rather than close it. To give the knowledge to people who had spent months making sport of it, who had offered nothing in the exchange except need. Why, I said finally, blunt and insufficient, but the only word I had. He looked at me. Because the land doesn't belong to anybody, he said. It only lends itself to the people who understand it, and understanding is not property. March 15th, 1888. Spring began its argument with the valley in mid-March. It was not a gentle argument. The valley's springs are like its winters, definitive, with opinions. The snow melt came fast, and the creek ran high, and the ground went from frozen to soft to actively muddy within 2 weeks, and everyone was managing the mud and the runoff and the particular chaos of livestock that have been confined through a hard winter, finally able to spread out again. Clara Jessup planted her first seeds from a Dee's collection in the 3rd week of March. She planted them in a section of her kitchen garden that a Dee's had identified as having good drainage and adequate sun. They'd walked the property together in February. A Dee's moving through the land with the eye of someone who reads it rather than merely looks at it, noting where water pooled and where it moved, and where the soil had a particular color that meant certain things. I wasn't there for the planting. I heard about it from Clara herself, who came into Fenwick's to buy planting supplies and mentioned it in the careful way she mentioned things she cared about, slightly obliquely, as if offering the information at arm's length until she was sure it was safe. They're in the ground, she said, the ones from a Dee's. Hopeful, I said. The boy, Hosteen, came by to look at the drainage, make sure the water would move right. 8 years old, and he knows more about my land than I do. She said this without bitterness, with something more like wonder, and underneath the wonder a kind of honest grief, the grief of recognizing how much you don't know, and understanding that not knowing has consequences. He learns from his grandfather. And his grandfather from his grandfather, she said. It goes back a ways, that knowing. She bought her planting supplies. At the door she stopped. I've been thinking about what it cost him, she said, not looking at me. To do all that and have people laugh and then have them come needing him. What it costs a person to be patient through all of that. A great deal, I expect, I said. More than he'll say, she said. That's how you know the size of it, by what isn't being said. She went out into the March mud and drove her cart home, and I stood in Fenwick's store for a while with that last sentence sitting in my chest. March 28th, 1888. Ellison began digging his own cellar on the 28th. 20 feet was his target, and he'd enlisted Whitfield and 2 others to help with the labor, working in rotation the way you have to when you're doing heavy excavation in your spare time. Keokuk came over on the second day and spent 3 hours with them, advising on the angle of approach, the stone selection for lining, the particular problem of the corner fitting that he'd navigated imperfectly and wanted to see done correctly the second time. I was there for part of this. I watched Keokuk crouch at the edge of Ellison's developing shaft and explain, with a stick drawing in the dirt and a series of patient demonstrations with actual stones, how to set a face stone so that it drew moisture away from the center rather than toward it. I watched 3 men who had spent months being dismissive of this exact knowledge receive it with a focused attention that was indistinguishable from respect. Soames was not there, but I had heard from Desmond Chalk that Soames had ridden out to Keokuk's place the previous week, alone, on a morning when the mud was bad and the ride was harder than it needed to be, and had spent 2 hours asking questions about siting and depth for a cellar on his own property. Desmond said that Soames had offered to pay for the consultation and that Keokuk had declined, and that Soames had then asked what he could do instead, and that Keokuk had said he didn't know yet, but that if Soames was willing to help organize the valley's water rotation next winter, if there was a next winter like this one, that would be something. Soames apparently agreed without hesitation. This is not a redemption story, I want to be clear about that. Soames did not become a different man. He remained large, loud, confident, occasionally overbearing, and constitutionally incapable of the kind of introspection that produces genuine humility. But he became a man who had a specific concrete lesson written into his experience, and who made a specific concrete change in how he behaved in a specific domain. That is less than transformation and more than nothing, and I've come to think that most of what actually changes in the world lives in that particular space. April 4th, 1888. The ground was soft enough to run survey measurements again, and Hecht gave me a week's work along the eastern creek section that would take me past Keokuk's place on the last day if I planned the route right. I planned it right. I arrived in late afternoon, when the light was doing that April thing where it comes in low and golden and makes everything look like it was designed to be looked at. The homestead was busy in the warm weather way, a D's in the garden, which was already more elaborate than I'd seen the previous year, with a careful arrangement of plantings that I couldn't name but that clearly had a system. Hosteen was somewhere with the cattle. Keokuk was at the cellar, not drawing water, just at it, standing beside it with his hand on the timber windlass looking down. I've seen that posture in people who are checking something, confirming that it's still what they left it as. He looked up when I approached. "Still working," I said, gesturing at the shaft. "Always," he said. We stood there for a moment in the April light. Somewhere in the garden, Adiz was singing something quietly, not a song I recognized, in a language I didn't know, with a quality of sound that belonged to this specific place and this specific afternoon in a way I found difficult to describe. "I'm leaving next month," I said. "Hecht's work is done. The survey company has a job north of here past the Mesa country." He nodded, not sadly, not gladly, just he received the information. I wanted to, I stopped, started again. "I have this log, I've been writing everything down since September." "I know," he said. "I want to make a copy of the sections about the cellar, the construction, the geology, the winter, if you'd permit it." He looked at me with that long, calm assessment. "What will you do with it?" "Give it to someone who can use it," I said. "A land office, maybe, or a university survey, or just keep it, pass it along when it matters." I paused. "You said what's written stays." He was quiet for a moment. The singing continued from the garden. "Make your copy," he said. "Write it true." "I'll try," I said. "Write the laughing too," he said, "not just the water." "Why?" He picked up a stone from the pile near the cellar, looked at it, set it down. "Because the laughing is part of the knowledge," he said. "If you only write the water, people learn that the ground holds water at depth. That's useful." He looked at me. "If you write the laughing too, people learn something about what it costs to hold knowledge that others aren't ready for. That's," he paused, searching for the right word, "necessary." I thought about all the people who had held knowledge that others weren't ready for. About all the things that had been built and discovered and understood by people who had done it while being laughed at, and how rarely the laughter makes it into the record alongside the achievement, because achievements get to be proud and laughter is embarrassing in retrospect, and no one wants their embarrassment preserved. "I'll write the laughing," I said. April 12th, 1888. My last full week in Holt Valley. I spent part of it making the copies I'd promised, careful, word-for-word transcription of the log entries I thought were most useful, plus a supplementary geological note I wrote separately about the valley's soil composition and what it implied about subsurface water behavior. I bound these into a small document that I addressed to the Territorial Land Survey Office in Santa Fe, with a note explaining what it was and where it came from. The rest of the time I spent the way you spend last weeks in places, half present, already partly elsewhere, storing things in the particular way you store places you know you'll need to remember. The smell of Fenwick's store, which was oats and pine resin and something metallic from the proximity to Desmond's forge. The sound the creek made in spring, which was nothing like the silence of it frozen. The light at the western end of the valley in the early morning, where Keokuk's homestead sat, with the cellar's timber frame visible against the sky. I went once more, the Thursday before I left. Adiz had seeds for me. I hadn't expected this, hadn't asked, hadn't thought of it. But she came out of the house with a folded cloth packet and pressed it into my hands and said, "For wherever you go next, the ground up north is different. These ones adapt." I didn't know what to say. "Thank you," I managed. "You wrote things down," she said. "That's not nothing." This was the second time someone in this family had said this to me, and the second time I heard it as both gift and gentle challenge. The acknowledgement of what I'd done offered alongside the awareness of what I hadn't. I carried the seeds in my coat pocket all the way to Santa Fe. April 18th, 1888, final entry, Holt Valley. I left on a Thursday morning, which felt right, because I'd arrived on a Thursday, and there was a symmetry to it that appealed to whatever part of my brain handles such things. The valley was green, really properly green, the deep, satisfied green of land that has received enough winter moisture and is now doing what it was always going to do. The creek was running clear and full. The cattle, settlers' cattle and Keokuk's Criollo both, were out on the early grass, doing the cattle thing of eating steadily and purposefully, which is fundamentally the same regardless of breed. I stopped at the cellar one last time, no particular reason except that I needed to. It was, in the April morning, an unremarkable thing to look at. A hole in the ground with a timber frame around it, a windlass, a rope. You could ride past it without looking twice. You could dismiss it. I looked at it for several minutes. Then I rode east, toward the pass, toward the road to Santa Fe and whatever was north of Santa Fe. In my saddlebag was my log, all of it, September through April, and in my coat was the folded cloth of Adiz's seeds, and in whatever part of a person holds things that change them, there was something I was carrying that I hadn't had when I arrived. I don't have a clean single word for it either. Postscript written in Santa Fe, May 1888. I submitted the geological document to the Land Survey Office. A clerk looked at it with modest interest and filed it somewhere. I don't know if anyone ever read it. I made a second copy and sent it to a professor of geology at a university back east whose name I found in a survey journal. I received a response 4 months later that said my observations about subsurface thermal stability in valley formations were of moderate interest, and that my descriptions of the construction techniques were anecdotal but suggestive. He asked if I could provide precise depth measurements, and I wrote back that I could provide my surveyor's estimates, which were close. I never heard from him again. I heard from Desmond Chalk, who wrote me a letter the following winter. He said that 7 families had sunk cellars of varying depth before the next January, and that the second winter, colder again in December but moderate by comparison in the deep months, had found the valley considerably better prepared. He said that Soames had organized a winter water protocol before the cold arrived, with Keokuk's consultation, and that it had run smoothly because there was nothing to respond to in crisis, just a system already in place. He said that Clara Jessup's seeds came up in May of 1888, and that several of the varieties she'd planted from Adiz's collection were, by his description, doing remarkably well compared to the usual stock, and that she'd given starts to 3 neighbors before the summer was out. He said Hosteen had started teaching some of the valley's children, casually and without ceremony, about the plants and water behavior and cattle of his grandfather's homestead. Not as a school, just as the natural transfer of knowledge between children who spend time together. He said Keokuk had been asked to speak at a meeting of the settler families in November, before the cold came, about winter preparation. He said Keokuk had come, and that what he'd said was brief, and that the meeting had been useful. I read that letter in Santa Fe in January 1889, sitting in a boarding house with snow outside and a fire inside, and I thought about a man digging 40 feet into the earth while people laughed, and about the specific character of patience required to do that, the patience that is not passive, not resigned, but active, deliberate. The patience of someone who understands that the land will be what it is regardless of whether the people living on it choose to understand it, and who makes a shaft in the earth anyway because the knowledge that goes unbuilt is knowledge that dies. I planted Adie's seeds in the spring of 1889 in a small patch of ground near a rooming house in Tucson, where I was working a survey job. Most of them grew. I gave the ones I didn't have room for to the woman who ran the rooming house, and I told her where they'd come from.